Hello, my name is Alejandra Gallardo, and this is my senior thesis for environmental studies at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. My thesis is titled When Home Won't Let You Stay: How Climate Change is Driving Central American Migration. The quoted part of the title is reference to a really moving poem by UK writer Warson Shire titled Home, and I've highlighted a part of that poem here as well. I recommend you check it out sometime. I wanted to understand more about what conditions people face in their countries of origins that could push them to move somewhere else, especially because in countries like the United States, the conversation on Latin American immigrants is laden with messages that either antagonize or victimize immigrants. I was further able to apply an environmental lens to the issue through my work as a community organizer on campus and by preparing research for the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Madrid, Spain last December. Creating a senior thesis has allowed me to take a step further into these issues. To give some context, thousands of migrant caravans have been coming from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. These are countries that face systemic corruption, violence, and poverty, but the focus on violence overlooks problems that have become amplified by climate change. As the impacts of climate change become more severe, it is likely that the Global South, those countries least responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, will have the greatest number of environmental migrants. And among these countries, the most vulnerable will be those with limited financial and social resources. A third of all employment in Central America is linked to agriculture, so any disruption to farming practices can have devastating consequences. Smallholder farmers are pressured to move to the city to seek jobs that will provide sustenance for their families. These are jobs that are largely low in quality and pay. When they arrive to another city or to the United States, they tend to occupy poor quality neighborhoods where there may be hazardous toxins or barriers to a healthy livelihood. Currently, there are no protections being implemented to protect climate displaced people. So migrants face challenges in keeping their families intact and finding secure sources of housing, education, and employment. I've also read articles that warn us of incoming legal immigrants crossing the border to threaten American sovereignty, making a dangerous environment and sentiment towards immigrants. I'm hoping that my research will help offer a different narrative than the ones we see on mainstream media. With all that, I was interested in researching the question, to what extent does climate change influence migration in Central America? And here I have one of my favorite artworks by Ricardo Levins Morales on environmental justice that highlights the destruction of oppression on both our human bodies and earthly homes. To conduct this research, I am drawing from a trip that I took to Honduras and El Salvador in November of 2019 with a grassroots organization in Minneapolis called Copal, Minnesota, standing for Communities Organizing for Latinx Action and Power. Through this trip, we explored the impacts of climate displacement through meetings and dialogue with civil society organizations, municipal officials, and families at the front lines of displacement. During our trip, we visited one village in Honduras and 4 communities in El Salvador, and hosted additional meetings with pastoral, humanitarian, and independent news members from both countries, and used all of this to construct the narratives for the respective regions. And here, you can't really see the purple community that I highlighted here because it was right next door to this blue one. So they're both located right here in this area. And this gray line is the border between El Salvador and Honduras, but you can't really see it there. Another thing that I'll talk about is the dry corridor, which is a space running here through Central America that is characterized by its irregular rainfall and extended 4-month dry period. These regions of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua are highly susceptible to climate change. One of the communities we visited was Nuevo Gualcho, El Salvador, where community organizing was very important. This is a community that was established in the 90s by guerrilla Civil War veterans. They mainly farm corn for subsistence, but the elders have a great priority for sharing their wisdom and values with the youth, which is really great to encounter. one of the concerns in the region is that in 2015, drought cost nearly 100 million in lost corn and bean harvests. And the locals have noticed an increased irregularity and unpredictability of extreme weather events, particularly the drought. The data on water availability in El Salvador is shocking. Over 90% of surface water sources in the country are contaminated, mainly attributed to unregulated sewage disposal and industrial runoff, including the agriculture sector. Over 600,000 people in rural El Salvador don't have access to drinking water, and aquifers in the country have receded as much as 13 feet in recent years. This poses a big problem for youth in the communities because they don't see a lot of opportunities in agriculture. So a lot of the times families will save up thousands of dollars just to send members of the family outside to either the city in El Salvador or to neighboring countries or the United States so that they can find opportunities for education and employment, which then these members that migrate out of the community send money back to the families. So a lot of the income in these rural communities is actually from family members that have left. And this is a theme that we saw across a lot of the communities we visited in both countries. Another community I wanted to highlight was Huapinol in Honduras. I was really moved by the resilience I saw in a community where family members have been kidnapped, killed, and threatened by military and police protecting a mining project upstream. In 2018, a mining corporation called Inversiones Pinares began mining iron and dumping waste in the river, leaving the water thick and brown with contamination, which one of the women living there described as chocolate water. The water that was used by the community for cooking, bathing, and drinking became unusable for those living downstream of the mining operations. In response, the community organized what they called the Huapinol Camp in defense of water and life by the mining corporation's entrance, taking turns cooking and camping for 88 consecutive days. The resistance resulted in police wounding locals. And another thing that we see here, similarly to El Salvador, is a projected decrease in water availability in the coming decades and increasing conflict as the water becomes more scarce. Here, I have a few points to conclude. Firstly, environmental migration is multi-causal, meaning it can't be isolated as the sole driver of migration, but it does intensify the impact of weather events in the dry corridor. As mentioned before, there are no legal resources to support migrants. If anything, we see a growing hostility towards immigrants that result in a cruel treatment at and beyond national borders. Lastly, the conflict between police and people protecting water and land reminded me of the struggles going on around the world, and even here in Minnesota. The global north carries a lot of responsibility by protecting and fueling the interests of extractive multinational corporations. One of the big reasons I wanted to do this research was to share narratives from real people. If we can all walk away becoming more aware of migrant issues or even wanting to learn more about how to support migrants in our communities, then we are walking away as catalysts to transform our communities. It's not easy work, but it's important to share this knowledge. Another important message that I came across is one of hope. Despite the challenges we visited, these communities found ways to empower their youth and continue advocating for their livelihoods. The Novo Gualcho community I mentioned earlier is proud of obtaining a solar panel system for water pumping and sanitation. They also gathered resources to build the 15th National Library of El Salvador. One of the questions that people often have is, what can we do? That's why I included this final point in my conclusion. Just because these issues are going on in another country doesn't mean we're isolated from it. Not only are migrants present in Minnesota, we host over 100,000 Latin American immigrants. But there are also Black, Indigenous, people of color, and rural communities in the United States struggling to defend their water, land, and rights. The struggle that comes to mind is with the Line 3 pipeline threatening to bring toxic tar sands from Canada through Minnesota into Wisconsin, crossing over 192 bodies of water, including the Mississippi River twice. I encourage you to stay updated on its progress and ways you can get involved in resisting it and other extractive projects. That's a whole other conversation, but thank you for taking the time to view my presentation. If you're interested in Latinx environmental justice work, I highly recommend connecting with Copal Minnesota through their website, Facebook, or YouTube.